Hey guys, Jay here. So today we're gonna be taking a look at a loudspeaker I've been personally really curious about. And mainly because a lot of people online seems to really love this loudspeaker to use with tube amplifiers. And as you guys know, I'm a pretty big tube amplifier fan. And this is the loudspeaker. This is the Origin S-10 from Liisong. And as you may know, Liisong does make their own drivers and they are pretty well regarded, at least in China, Hong Kong, in some parts of the world, and here in North America as well from my understanding. So very curious about it. This speaker is 100 dB in sensitivity, so they're fairly easy to drive, and doing a quick impedance measurement as well, you can see that it doesn't dip below 6 ohms. So fairly easy load to drive for any amplifier, but especially for tube amplifiers, it's a really good match because of its sensitivity. You can power it with virtually 8 watts, 3 watts, even 1 watt amplifiers to great success. However, looking at the impedance graph, once again, we see a lot of wiggly lines, and those wiggly lines really indicate resonance. And we see a lot of those wiggly lines, which means there's a lot of resonance with this loudspeaker. And that's no surprise. Doing a quick knock test on these loudspeakers, it is quite evident that it is a very resonant box. And not only that, when I was doing the binding post, I noticed how just screwing on and screwing off the binding post, putting the banana cables in, the entire cabinet resonates while you do that. Probably my first time experiencing something like that, so I knew even before doing the impedance measurement that we're gonna see some resonances. Now, aside from the resonance itself, the cabinet itself is well built and it looks very nice for the price point of $3,300. The pair that I have right here is the more lighter finish, but they also have a walnut finish as well. And the gold trim on the front baffle does look really nice, but I would add that it does seem a little bit cheap to my kind of eyes, and feel and touch is a bit cheap, and the overall finish is looks nice at first, but when you spend some time with it, you do feel that they've cut some corners in the overall build quality of this loudspeaker. But for the price point of $3,300, especially now that the driver has been upgraded to their Silver Evo, which if you look at the pricing of the Liisong drivers on their website, takes a significant portion of the price of the speakers itself, you can kind of see where the money is going, since especially because there's no cost to the crossover itself. Once again, no crossover in this speaker. So majority of the sound that you're hearing is coming from this 10-inch driver from Liisong. So it's a full range driver covering 20 Hz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. And as with most full range drivers, they do suffer from extension in the really high frequencies and the extension in the really low frequencies. So they're really good at covering that mid band, but when it comes to the extreme frequencies, they tend to kind of struggle because those are kind of reserved. And the reason why 15-inch much larger drivers exist in the first place that take that role in other more two-way, three-way kind of loudspeaker designs. In this case, this driver is trying to do everything, and naturally that doesn't go really well in terms of covering the extreme ranges as efficiently as drivers dedicated to those ranges. So overall, the sound of the speaker to me, all across the board, from my experience with it for the last few months, has been that it sounds a little bit thin, especially in that bass region where I'm more used to speakers producing a lot of bass and more, kind of oomph in that mid-bass region especially. But I don't quite get that with this loudspeaker. For example, in the lower chesty voiceness of male vocals, you don't quite get that with this loudspeaker. Playing through multiple different tracks, I feel that a lot of the tracks seem to kind of scooch over to that more lean presentation, meaning even the warmer tracks sound less warm than how I'm more used to. So for example, tracks like by Leonard Cohen, a lot of his tracks have that chesty male voice, and overall I would categorize it as a more warm kind of tracks. But with this speaker, I don't particularly find it as warm. Still warm because track itself is warm, but I don't feel as of that chestiness and warmth that I would usually get with more bass heavy loudspeakers. And then the weird thing is the soundstage is pretty good. The high frequency is really airy and really spacious. And overall, it gives an illusion of that kind of pure sound from a single driver. It does. If you look at it in a bad way, it is sounding lean and a little bit too thin. But if you look at it in a good way, it sounds transparent and it sounds kind of airy and lively. So you do get that with this loudspeaker. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. It's definitely not a linear loudspeaker. It is more of a fun sounding loudspeaker. And you will see that in the measurement itself. So this is the frequency response of the loudspeaker. And as you can see, it does have quite impressive bass for a single driver, but a lot of that, as we'll see in a minute, comes from the cabinet itself. It has about 5 ports in the back, and all of them are tuned to the same frequency, very low, so that you get that a little bit more exaggeration in the lower extension. So a lot of that is the resonance, and a lot of that is the tuning of the cabinet itself to produce that more lower bass. But as you can see, you get a pretty heavy kind of dip all across the lower mid-range and mid-bass region, which kind of accounts for what I heard in my place. It just doesn't have that mid-bass oomph and gut to the sound that I personally enjoy a lot with other loudspeakers. Now, when it comes to the rest half of the mid-range as well as the upper mid-range, we get a pretty, plus minus 6 dB, 5 dB, kind of representation of the sound. And that's kind of what I heard. The mid-range on these are not too bad. In fact, I would categorize it as kind of entertaining. Like I said, even though the overall sound is lean, I do get a sense of this a little bit more pure kind of sound, an illusion of pureness to the sound. And it really comes through in that mid-range, stuff like jazz, like I said, even Leonard Cohen sounds more pure, sounds more transparent because of that. But also that high frequency also has something to do with it. Now, that high frequency is pretty high peak up there. As you can see, it's peaking pretty high. So definitely you don't want to have the speaker towed directly towards the listener. It can be quite fatiguing, and that aligns with my experience as well. When I did tow the speaker straight to my face, to my ears, my listening position, it did tend to sound a little bit more bright, more brilliant, and a little bit more fatiguing more quickly. So you don't want to have them face directly towards you, and we'll talk about the optimal position to have these a little bit more tamed in that high frequency in just a minute. But I wanted to quickly also show you the measurement by Liisong themselves of their drivers, and a lot of people looking at this graph will be like, wow, that actually measures pretty linear, pretty well. How does it differ so much from your measurements, Jay? And my answer to that is actually they are pretty close. So if you look at their scale is a 120 dB scale on the y-axis, as you can see. And if you look at my graph, it's actually 50 dB, which is the standard that I use. So you can see that my measurements are a little bit more punched in or a little bit more magnified. But if I put my measurements into the same scale they have, as you can see here, it's pretty similar, except for that bass region that the cabinet, is clearly helping out there. So overall, we can definitely say that the overall sound subjectively to me, and as well as the data suggests, that it's not a neutral loudspeaker and it's definitely colored. And personally for me, it was a little bit too lean for my personal liking. But I did like that mid-range and I did like that high frequency. But that high frequency, really you have to have the setup correctly to get a little bit more tamed high frequency. I did not like these speakers directly towed towards me. I like them with a slight toe in. And the reason for that would be this horizontal off-axis response that you can see here. This is a 10 degree, 15 degree, and 30 degree off-axis. And as you can see, the moment you toe these speakers slightly 10 degrees, the high frequency falls off like, it just falls off right there. And this is typical behavior, but also a little bit more unusually faster roll off with this loudspeaker. And looking at the vertical off-axis, you can see that you want to be sitting around 6 inches at the very minimum from the center of the drivers itself. And you can see the high frequency and the overall response is a bit more linear. And so in combination, I decided to do my setup this way, and this was done before I took the measurements, and this is what I preferred, was slight toe-in with sitting above about 6 inches from the center of the drivers. And the good thing is that the height of the speakers itself and where the drivers are mounted is pretty optimal for most seats, sofas, lounge chairs, and so on, to where you will naturally get that above 6-inch height. So contrary to a lot of advice I give to being on axis, with this loudspeaker particularly, I do prefer and recommend sitting above the center of the drivers, about 6 to 12 inches above the speaker's drivers. And so you can see that in combination, you can see right here, a comparison between an on-axis response and a slight toe-in plus a 6-inch seating position above the drivers. And you can see that the purple line is definitely more linear, more balanced throughout the frequencies. But unfortunately, looking at the entire response, you are unfortunately going to be left with that, kind of scoop in the bass and the lower mid-range, regardless of the setup process. And of course, even after all that effort, you're not gonna get anywhere near a accurate loudspeaker for studio use or for those that want accuracy. Definitely not the speaker for you. This is more a fun loudspeaker, like I said, for people that enjoy jazz music and that likes a little bit more pureness. And that scoop in the lower mid-range to the bass region does kind of take away that more kind of chestiness in the overall sound, giving a sense of more pureness in the voice, right? You get a little bit more cleanliness, more kind of transparency kind of effect. And this is kind of easily testable, similar effect to when you play subs and then you take away the subs. Sometimes the vocal region sounds a little bit more cleaner because you just taken away bass. And that's kind of like the effect that you get here with this loudspeaker. Now, first and foremost, I tried these speakers with my reference system that I mentioned. So I will link to that video in the description below of my reference system this ear. And in that system, I didn't enjoy it one bit. Even with the optimal setup, I did find the high frequency to be a little bit more brittle, a little bit too lean overall of a sound. But when I got some tube amplifiers, namely a tube integrated amplifier like the Triangle i20 here, which does have a really nice, richer sound, that mid-range sounded a lot more fuller. It sounded a little bit less lean. Now, overall, it still sounded a little bit more lean, and that transparency effect is still there, but I did find the overall sound to be a little bit more richer sounding and a little bit more pleasing to my ears, especially with jazz music and something like Leonard Cohen, something that has more heft and body to the sound. It came through a little bit more hefty with tube amplifiers, and I did really enjoy that. And the vocals do sound a little bit more mesmerizing because perhaps it's more face coherent, centered down the middle with really locked in kind of phantom imaging. But that quickly goes away once you crank up the volume on any of these systems. I personally find that, if you're in a large space, this may be different, but if you're in a space similar to mine or even just slightly bigger, if you crank up the volume, this speaker quickly loses imaging focus, perhaps because of its uneven off-axis responses, and the frequencies bouncing off the walls. It seems to kind of muddy up the imaging, but the soundstage itself is still enormous and still very pleasant, deep and wide soundstage. So for those that don't care about imaging, which I know a lot of people who choose speakers like these don't really care too much about imaging, like horn speakers and single drivers. A lot of people love that soundstage, but don't care about imaging too much. And if that is you, then this speaker does have that enormous soundstage, especially with tube amplifiers. Although I have to mention, integrated amplifiers like the Brunoco that I reviewed, which was a fantastic tube integrated amplifier from Korea, does tend to sound a little bit more bright with these loudspeakers because, the Brunoco, very similarly to these loudspeakers, do have that a little bit more excitement and airiness on top. And it, combined with these speakers, it becomes too much of a good thing. And it does tend to kind of make the sound a little bit way too lean than it already is. So really not a great match with these loudspeakers. And something like the Cayenne Jazz 80 amplifiers, actually I found to sound way more better with these loudspeakers if you want something a little bit more budget friendly than the Triangle i20. So overall, my recommendation for amplifier pairing with these loudspeakers would be to go with something that is warm, rich sounding, and if it's a tube amplifier, even better. But be careful even then to crank these up to loud levels. These speakers are not for that. I particularly enjoy these loudspeakers at lower volumes and even at mid volumes. Some tracks, especially modern tracks or not very well recorded tracks, tended to suffer because of that more transparency, clarity effect of these loudspeakers. I did find those tracks to kind of shred my ears, to put it lightly. However, with very well recorded tracks, even though I did miss that bass region, I did like that clarity effect, the transparency effect, or whatever you want to call it. where these drivers did sound very coherent, because it's a single driver. And I did find the vocals to be a little bit more mesmerizing than traditional, two-way or three-way loudspeakers, in that, you get that really nice locked-on phantom center, especially at lower volumes. And it is a little bit more kind of interesting in that mid-range with that transparency and clarity and kind of, things popping out at you more clearly without that bass kind of overshadowing those regions. So I'm not surprised if someone says, I've never heard this in this track until I heard with these speakers. I can see that because this loudspeaker does have the tendency to show you things that you've kind of not heard as prominently because you had that bass kind of overshadow those details a little bit. So interesting, very interesting loudspeaker. I would say there's a lot of things I don't like about it, but I can see why some people do love it. And I do have to give props to Liisong Audio for their driver design itself and the overall speaker design here, because even though it's not a perfectly, flat and neutral loudspeaker, they did an interesting job in terms of the cabinet taking over that bass, at least the sub bass, and elevating that, because single drivers are not great at, creating sub bass by themselves. And then for the high frequency, I was actually surprised that it was around 16 kilohertz, where the high frequency started to roll off pretty quickly. Usually you see it, much earlier on with single driver designs. So I can see that, the phase plug and the overall driver design has been optimized to extend a little bit more and perhaps too elevated in certain ways. But with the proper setup, you can kind of mitigate that to some regard. So I did find this speaker a quite interesting design, especially considering that there's no crossover in this loudspeaker, just the cabinet and the drivers tuning the entire sound that you hear. I did find it quite interesting. But personally for me, my personal reference and recommendation at this current price range from $3,000 to $4,500 price point is the Orendo 1723 THX loudspeakers. And you can find this updated list as it's being updated on my Discord page, but you do have to be a Patreon to view this live. But the Orendo 1723 THX tower loudspeakers are a little bit more expensive, around $500 to $600 more than these loudspeakers. But for that kind of money, I think those speakers are built way better than these loudspeakers. They're built with HDF, with heavy bracing, with almost no resonance to be found on the cabinet. And, contrary to that, you get a lot more resonance here, and you do get a lot more less of a linear frequency response and a lot less of that bass region as well, which is very prominent on the THX towers with heavy bass and really authoritative kind of control and dynamics. And even just the frequency extension and the high frequencies, the Orendos do have more of that. So overall, it's a more all-rounder speaker, and it is a more superior speaker in terms of how it performs, the data, and even my subjective kind of feedback. But if you like the overall sound profile of the Liisong S-10 Origin and you listen to mostly vocals and jazz at lower volumes, I can see how you may enjoy this speaker, especially if you like the idea of a high sensitivity loudspeaker, because these are definitely more sensitive than the Orendo 1723 THX towers are. Then I can see that a lot of people may enjoy these loudspeakers with tube amplifiers and so on. And I can definitely see how these speakers are well regarded in areas like Asia, where I went to Korea last year, or 2 years ago I should say, and I was very surprised that a lot of people, actually majority of the population, lived in apartments. So in those areas, definitely don't want to be pounding bass, and even the music taste and the cultural kind of sound profile, the music that they enjoy, a lot of it is catered towards the vocal region and not, particularly the bass. EDM and so on is not that prominent as far as I can tell in those regions. So, and especially in those apartments, in those environments, I can see why the speaker is well regarded with that kind of more clarity and transparent mid-range and vocal region that sounds a little bit more, more transparent and cliche, kind of clear kind of presentation, giving you all those details at lower to medium volumes. So that's pretty much it from me. I didn't really enjoy these speakers as much as I thought I would, but nevertheless, I enjoyed myself kind of more digging into these loudspeakers and finding out why they sound this way, and also really kind of experimenting with them and seeing why some people prefer it, and asking some of my friends actually that own similar speakers like these in Asia and so on. I did find that there is some merit to why some people like this type of sound, and especially with tube amplifiers in such, different environments. But personally for me, I like to rock out to music at loud volume sometimes, and I do like my bass. So in trade for transparency, not particularly my thing. But anyhow, I hope this video was helpful, entertaining, and if it was, please consider clicking that like button and subscribing for more, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Until next time.